What happens when ambition blinds compassion and power becomes more important than principle? Welcome to Detailed Book Summaries, where we explore the most thought-provoking books that challenge how we think, lead, and live. In today's video, we're diving into Careless People by Sarah Wynn-Williams, a cautionary tale that exposes the dark side of ambition, greed, and the high cost of losing sight of your ideals. If you ever wondered how good people go bad, or how unchecked power corrupts, this summary is for you. Before we begin, subscribe to Detailed Book Summaries and hit the bell icon so you never miss a story that could reshape your perspective. Chapter 1. The Illusion of Control. It all began with a sense of purpose. Sarah Wynn-Williams, a seasoned policy advisor, walked through the gleaming glass doors of Facebook's Menlo Park campus with a sense of conviction, maybe even awe. The place radiated possibility. Scooter-riding engineers zipped past murals that screamed of disruption and change. There were kombucha taps, idea walls, hackathons, and slogans etched into every surface. Move fast, be bold. Bring the world closer together. To an idealist, this was the epicenter of the new world. And Sarah was no stranger to big ideas. She had navigated political minefields before, advised powerful figures, and sat in rooms where words mattered. But nothing quite matched the velocity or the audacity of what she stepped into at Facebook. From the start, she was immersed in strategy meetings and policy brainstorms, sitting next to people who, just a few years earlier, were coding in dorm rooms. The pace was relentless, the culture intoxicating. The company wasn't just building software, it was reordering the fabric of society, one friend request, one algorithm tweak at a time. At least, that was the story they told themselves. But underneath the optimism and billion-dollar swagger, Sarah began to notice cracks. They weren't obvious at first. They started small, quiet dismissals of ethical concerns, risk analyses that sidestepped real-world impact, internal conversations that tiptoed around responsibility. There were meetings where difficult questions were met with blank stares or polished half-answers. Reports would surface about Facebook's role in election interference, disinformation, and mental health crises. And internally, the tone stayed the same. Stay the course, defend the platform, grow at all costs. The idealism that once powered her steps now started to weigh her down. She wasn't alone. Others whispered similar frustrations in hallways or behind Slack messages. But speaking up, really speaking up, came with consequences. Careers could stall. Rooms could go quiet. Invitations could stop arriving. Sarah was beginning to understand the unspoken rule of big tech. It wasn't enough to be smart or right. You had to be aligned. Aligned with the priorities of scale. Aligned with the pursuit of engagement, aligned with the belief that what they were building was too important to slow down. The control she thought she'd have, the ability to steer ethical direction, to hold powerful systems accountable, was an illusion. And slowly, that illusion began to collapse. This wasn't just a job. This was a machine, one that rewarded silence, punished doubt, and disguised ambition as idealism. And this was only the beginning. Chapter 2. The Cost of Conviction. Sarah had always believed that when the stakes were high, people rose to meet them. That when truth was laid bare, especially in a company so obsessed with transparency, someone, somewhere would do the right thing. But inside Facebook, she was learning a harsher truth. Sometimes the higher the stakes, the more elaborate the rationalizations. It began with Myanmar, a distant country for most Americans. But on Facebook's global map, Myanmar was a case study in everything the company claimed to care about: connection, freedom of speech, civic empowerment. Except, it had all gone horribly wrong. Misinformation and hate speech had poured to the platform unchecked. Militant voices were amplified. Violence followed. Real-world violence. Ethnic cleansing. The United Nations had named Facebook as a key factor in the genocide against the Rohingya people. Sarah had read the reports. She had seen the briefings. She had even sat in rooms where those tragedies were reduced to words like content moderation issues and market-level misalignment. That was a language of avoidance, the carefully sanitized phrasing that protected egos and quarterly goals. when she tried to raise her voice, to argue that the platform had failed not because of some technical oversight, but because of a deliberate strategy that prioritized engagement over safety, she got the look. The look that said, "We've heard enough." The people in charge weren't stupid. They were brilliant. They were informed. They knew the risks, the consequences, the blowback. But instead of course correcting, they pivoted. The problem wasn't the platform. They insisted. It was politics or local culture or a failure of government infrastructure. Never them. Never the code. Never the algorithms that fed outrage, rewarded lies, and buried nuance. Internally, it was called being constructive. But to Sarah, it felt like gaslighting. She watched as PR teams worked overtime to manage the fallout, crafting statements that sounded sincere but offered nothing. She saw executives pat themselves on the back for deploying half measures, like hiring content moderators for a region after thousands had already died. There was no accountability. There was only delay. And still, Sarah pushed. She brought up the need for human rights assessments before product launches. She advocated for proactive policy checks, for real conversations with civil society leaders on the ground. Sometimes she was listened to. Most of the time, she wasn't. Colleagues told her she was brave. Some told her she was naive. A few warned her gently to stop. But she couldn't. Not when she saw how power operated here. Not when she saw how easily idealism turned into complicity. There's a cause of conviction in a place that runs on consensus and code. It isolates you. It exhausts you. It makes you question your own clarity. But Sarah kept showing up, even as the walls closed in. She had come to Facebook to be part of something big. Now she realized just how big and dangerous that something truly was. The question wasn't whether she could fix it. The question was whether she could live with herself if she didn't try. Chapter 3. Loyalty to the machine. There's a certain kind of person Silicon Valley loves. A person who believes in the mission so much that they'll sacrifice everything for it. Time, sleep, boundaries, integrity. Sarah had started to notice how the word loyalty was used inside Facebook. It wasn't about loyalty to people, or to users, or even to truth. It was loyalty to the system, the product, the growth. If you challenge it, you were not a team player. If you question it publicly, you were radioactive. It wasn't always overt. It showed up in performance reviews, in who got invited to important meetings, in whose ideas were taken seriously. You didn't have to be the loudest advocate, just the one who never rocked the boat too hard. Inside the company, there were posters that read, "Nothing at Facebook is somebody else's problem." It sounded noble. Personal responsibility. Ownership. But Sarah began to see it for what it really was, a cover for a plausible deniability. If everything was everyone's responsibility, then no one had to be accountable, especially not the people at the top. Mark Zuckerberg loomed over everything. Not physically, he wasn't omnipresent, but structurally, his power was absolute. Dual-class shares meant that no matter how badly Facebook stumbled, no board could remove him. He didn't have to answer to shareholders. He answered only to himself. And the people around him? They knew it. Some were true believers. Others had simply learned to survive in his orbit. Sheryl Sandberg, the polished face of the operation, was often cast as the adult in the room. But even she had her limits. Sarah saw how power insulated itself, not just from criticism, but from self-reflection. What disturbed Sarah most wasn't the evil. It was the indifference, the passive approval. The thousands of micro-decisions made every day in favor of growth and engagement. Every tweak to the news feed, every algorithm adjustment, was designed to keep people scrolling longer, even if it meant promoting divisiveness, extremism, or outright lies. One internal conversation still haunted her. It was about a potential change that might reduce misinformation, but it would also reduce time spent on the platform. Someone in the room said, "Well, that's not aligned with our KPIs." And that was it. The conversation moved on. No one pushed back. No one asked, should we be measuring something different? It was in that moment Sarah understood. This wasn't negligence. It was design. She started to feel like an outsider. Meetings grew colder. Messages went unanswered. Colleagues who had once confided in her now kept their distance. The company didn't need to fire her. It could simply freeze her out. She began journaling again, late at night, trying to process it all. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had come to Facebook to help build bridges between tech and society. But now, she felt like she was watching a bridge collapse in slow motion, and everyone else just kept walking across it like nothing was happening. This was the culture of engineered loyalty. Loyalty not to people or principle, but to a machine that fed on clicks, data, and denial. Sarah wasn't sure how long she could last. But one thing had become crystal clear. If you want to change a system built on self-preservation, you have to be willing to walk away from it. And more terrifyingly, you have to be ready for it to walk away from you. Chapter 4. Metrics over morals. Everything had a number. Everything. Sarah could remember sitting in an all-hands meeting, staring at a slide that proudly declared, "Time on site increased by 17% this quarter." The room clapped. Smiles all around. Another win. But no one asked what that 17% meant. No one asked why people were staying longer. And definitely no one asked what it was costing them. That's what Facebook had perfected. Not just the art of attention, but the illusion of neutrality. The platform wasn't telling you what to think, they insisted. They were just showing you what you liked. But Sarah knew better now. The algorithms didn't just reflect your preferences. They shaped them. They twisted them. They weaponized them. She had seen the internal data. She had sat in those quiet meetings where engineers and policy people examined case studies with barely concealed unease. A teenage girl spiraling into eating disorder content. A newly unemployed man dragged into violent conspiracies. A retiree swallowed whole by political extremism. And every time, the same defense. The user chose to engage. As if people weren't being nudged, provoked, trapped. Sarah remembered one particularly disturbing project, an internal experiment on emotional contagion. Without warning, Facebook had tweaked users' feeds to show either more positive or more negative content to see how it influenced their own posts. It worked. People became sadder when exposed to sad content, angrier when fed anger. No consent, no warning, just manipulation because they could. And it wasn't just that project. It was the whole system. Engagement was king. Comments, shares, reactions, those were the metrics that drove the machine. And the machine had learned, outrage engages. Lies spread faster than truth. Conflict fuels clicks. Sarah once asked an engineer, "Why are we pushing content that's obviously false?" He didn't flinch, because it performs. And there it was, the moral compass replaced by a dashboard. She started noticing how this mindset infected everything. When a piece of content went viral, no one asked if it was ethical, only whether it could be monetized. Even the teams responsible for trust and safety were measured by productivity. How many tickets closed, how many decisions made, not whether harm was actually reduced. Sarah thought about the early days, when Facebook still talked about connection like it was sacred. Now it felt more like surveillance dressed in idealism. People weren't being connected. They were being categorized, sliced into data points, then fed back content designed to keep them addicted. Even the internal culture mimicked this logic. Employees were encouraged to measure their own performance with dashboards and OKRs, objectives and key results. If your work didn't move a metric, it didn't matter. You could write the most thoughtful policy memo, but if it didn't boost engagement or reduce churn, it was invisible. So what happened to the stuff that didn't show up on a chart? What happened to truth? To harm? To decency? Sarah knew the answer. They were ignored. Because this was a company where metrics mattered more than morals. Where the question was never what's right, but always what scales. She felt it in her bones now. The company had become a reflection of its product. Fast-moving, emotionally reactive, surface level, and always hungry. But the worst part? She wasn't sure anyone in power saw a problem with that. Chapter 5. The Fallacy of Scale. There was a word that came up in nearly every meeting Sarah attended. Scale. Can it scale? Will it scale? How fast can we scale? It was a holy grail of tech. The belief that if you could just build something that scaled effortlessly, you could change the world, and Facebook had scaled. Oh, It had scaled better than anyone. Billions of users, trillions of likes, enough data to map the human psyche 1,000 times over. But here's what no one said out loud. The things that scaled the best weren't always the things that made life better. Sometimes they were the exact opposite. Sarah remembered working on a misinformation report ahead of a major election. It was a mess. The moderation team was understaffed. The policy guidelines were vague, and the algorithm had no problem pushing sensational lies right to the top of people's feeds. It was chaos. But the leadership response? This isn't a scalability issue. And that was exactly the problem. The fallacy of scale, the belief that bigger is always better, had infected the company's DNA. Facebook wasn't optimizing for impact. It was optimizing for replication. It didn't matter if something caused harm in one corner of the world, because it performed well across the board. The metrics washed the blood clean. Sarah had once asked, why are we applying the same content rules in Myanmar that we use in Milwaukee? The answer, because it's scalable. Never mind that in Myanmar, hate speech on Facebook had helped incite genocide. That content moderation required nuanced culture, history, things that couldn't be automated or A/B tested. Scale made that inconvenient. And inconvenience wasn't profitable. She began to see the real structure of power inside the company. Engineers first, growth second, ethics last. Policy teams were often brought in after product had already been shipped, tasked not with preventing harm, but minimizing backlash. They were cleanup crews. And every time someone raised concern, the same shield came up. But we can't bill for every corner case. Except these corner cases were people. Whole communities. Entire nations. Sarah saw the same dynamic again and again. Whether it was a new feature rollout or a response to scandal, the guiding question was always, how does this scale? Never, should this scale? It was like watching a wildfire being praised for its efficiency. And the architects of it all were convinced they were neutral players. They weren't making decisions, they insisted. They were just letting the system evolve. But the system had been designed. It had values, even if no one called them that. Efficiency over empathy, speed over scrutiny, growth over everything. Sarah began to realize something uncomfortable. Facebook wasn't broken. It was functioning exactly as intended. This wasn't a tech company with a people problem. It was a people problem with a tech company strapped to its back like a jet engine. And the faster it scaled, the more the system rewarded indifference. Because care didn't scale. Compassion didn't scale. But rage, division, lies, those scale beautifully. Chapter 6. The Myth of Neutrality. It was subtle at first. A phrase slipped into meetings. We're just a platform. A line repeated like gospel. We don't take sides. It sounded responsible, clean, almost noble. But to Sarah, it became one of the most dangerous lies the company ever told itself. Because neutrality, in practice, wasn't neutral at all. She remembered the moment it hit her. During a crisis response meeting after another viral video had sparked national outrage. The content had stayed up for hours. Not because it wasn't harmful, but because it didn't technically break any rules. It had avoided the edge cases the moderation system was trained to catch. It danced just far enough outside the written policy to be allowed. And so leadership shrugged, we don't arbitrate truth. But Sarah saw what that meant on the ground. It meant hate speech couched as opinion was protected speech. It meant falsehoods about vaccines could circulate because they weren't provably deadly. It meant genocide denial could live next to birthday photos and cat videos because the platform wasn't in the business of judgment. That was the myth of neutrality. It offered cover for inaction. What people didn't understand was that platforms make choices, even when they claim they don't. What the algorithm promotes, what gets flagged, what stays up, what goes down, all of it is designed. All of it reflects values. And Facebook had values, just not the ones it advertised. Its real values were hidden in its incentives. The stuff that got reach, that stirred emotion. The content that paid, that provoked debate, conflict, fury. The things that were easy to moderate, that were written in English in the US by users who behaved in predictable patterns. Everything else, nuance, context, history, was too messy to matter. Sarah once asked a senior policy lead, if we know something is harmful, but it doesn't violate the written rules, why can't we remove it? He gave her the look, the we're not in the censorship business look. Then he said it flat, that's a slippery slope. But wasn't this a slope? Allowing disinformation to metastasize in the name of neutrality? Letting content fester in communities that didn't have the resources or privilege to fight back? She kept circling back to one phrase. We don't want to be the arbiters of truth. But was it not intervening its own form of arbitration? And what about the algorithm? It wasn't passive. It didn't wait for users to seek out content. It suggested, pushed, amplified. It curated a version of reality that suited engagement, and then it stepped back and called it organic. Sarah had seen the breakdowns. False information got shared 6 times faster than corrections. Conspiracy theories outperformed reputable news. Hate speech was 10 times more engaging than peaceful dialogue. And every time, the excuse was the same. We're not telling people what to believe, but they were shaping what people saw. And that made all the difference. To pretend that wasn't influence, to act like the design of the system didn't shape behavior, was not just naive. It was negligent. Sarah could no longer stomach the smug detachment of the leadership team. They weren't building a neutral platform. They were designing a weapon and insisting it was a mirror. And in the silence of their so-called neutrality, chaos flourished. Chapter 7, When Metrics Become Morality. They didn't call it a scoreboard, but that's what it was. Deep inside Facebook's Menlo Park campus, on the big screens lining the war rooms and data floors, the metrics blinked in real time. DU, MU, time on platform, engagement rate, ad impressions, numbers, glorious numbers, clean, comforting, absolute. To the executives, these numbers weren't just indicators of success. They were truth. They were morality. They told you what mattered, what worked, what won. Sarah used to find that exciting, being able to see exactly what users did when they did it and what they'd likely do next. It was power disguised as insight. But the longer she stayed, the more she saw how easily those numbers were worshipped. The more she saw how quickly ethics were outsourced to performance graphs. If a new feature made users angrier but kept them engaged longer, it was marked a win. If a tweak to the feed reduced the spread of misinformation but dropped time on site by 3%, it was quietly shelved. No debate, no discussion. The numbers had spoken, and no one wanted to argue with growth. Sarah once brought up concerns about a new comment feature being tested. It was boosting toxicity across certain groups. The data team's response? But replies per thread are up 24%. When she asked if that was a good thing, someone joked, engagement is engagement. That was the mantra. Engagement. Like a god, they didn't have to understand. Just serve. There was no metric for well-being. No graph that showed social trust. No dashboard light that blinked when the fabric of democracy was fraying. If it couldn't be counted, it didn't count. And so the system evolved, not by design, but by metric. Outrage grew because it grew engagement. Division deepened because it kept people commenting. Lies flourished because they were sticky, clickable, shareable. Even when harm was proven, it was filtered through cost-benefit analysis. Will fixing this issue slow user growth in India? Will adding friction reduce ad impressions? Will prioritizing reliable news over viral content decrease time on feed? They never asked, is it right? Because right wasn't measurable. And what wasn't measurable couldn't be optimized. Sarah started to feel sick when she heard product teams celebrate a spike in DAU following a scandal. They didn't ask why people were rushing back to the platform, just that they were. That was the win. That was the KPI. One engineer even joked, outrage is our best growth hack. And no one corrected him. Somewhere along the way, they had confused what was good for the platform with what was good about it. Growth had become virtue. Scale had become purpose. Metrics had become morality. And morality? That had been buried under a pile of PowerPoint slides and OKRs. Sarah realized this wasn't just about carelessness. It was about abdication. When you let the numbers decide what's right, you've already given up your soul. You've replaced values with variables. And you call it innovation. But it's not. It's just surrender in a hoodie. And no matter how fast the dashboard updated, it would never show them what they were really breaking. Chapter 8. The Cost of Convenience. In the beginning, Facebook sold a simple promise. Connection made easy. Click, scroll, share, instant feedback, instant gratification. The world at your fingertips. But as Sarah dug deeper, she realized that convenience came at a price few were willing to pay attention to. Users loved the seamless experience, the effortless flow from one piece of content to the next. It was addictive by design, crafted to require the least effort, while delivering the most reward. Yet behind the scenes, the company was quietly exploiting that ease. Every swipe, every click, every pause was a data point, a window into human behavior, preferences, fears, and desires. But convenience wasn't free. It was the currency of sacrifice. By giving users what they wanted effortlessly, Facebook asked for something in return. Their attention, their time, their data, and ultimately, their privacy and autonomy. Sarah remembered a meeting where a product lead proudly presented a new feature that auto-played videos silently as users scrolled. The goal? More engagement, more ad impressions. The cost? Users were trapped in an endless passive consumption loop, hardly aware of how much time they'd lost. And it wasn't just time. It was mental energy, emotional health, and sometimes truth. Because the path of least resistance favored sensationalism, outrage, and simplicity over nuance, complexity, and skepticism. Convenience made it easy to share without thinking, to react without reflecting, to believe without questioning. It transformed critical judgment into reflex, deep thought into shallow scrolling. And every algorithm tweak nudged users a little further down this path. Sarah saw how this convenience created dependency, subtly eroding people's ability to manage their own digital lives. The more effortless the experience, the less control users felt they had. She thought about her own friends, who confessed feeling anxious when their phones were out of reach, who couldn't remember a time without the endless feed. The company marketed this ease as freedom, but it was a gilded cage. And the most insidious part? Few questioned it. Because in a world where everything is just a tap away, the cost of convenience is often invisible until it's too late. Sarah understood then that the true challenge wasn't building better tools. It was reclaiming the space to think, question, and choose. And that would never be as easy as clicking a button. Chapter 9. The Illusion of Control. On the surface, Facebook promised its users control. Control over their feeds, their privacy, their connections. Tools to customize, block, mute, unfollow. The illusion was clear. You're in charge here. But Sarah knew better. Behind the interfaces and toggles was a reality much less empowering. Control was scripted, limited, curated, designed to keep users feeling safe without rocking the boat of engagement and profit. Users could decide what content to hide, but they couldn't decide what content the algorithm prioritized. They could block one harasser, but couldn't escape the swarm of coordinated misinformation flooding their feeds. Privacy settings were labyrinthine, often buried deep, changing constantly, a maze most users gave up on before they even started. And the company's definition of control was shaped by what it allowed, not what users truly needed. Sarah recalled a data briefing where the team was excited about a new customization feature. But when she dug in, it became clear the feature was more about collecting preferences to feed better ads than actually respecting user choices. Control, she realized, was a carefully managed illusion, a psychological pacifier that reduced complaints while leaving the deeper system untouched. Even when users thought they had taken action, the platform's invisible forces were still steering them. The algorithm would learn from user behavior, but only within parameters set to maximize time spent and clicks. It nudged people toward content that confirmed biases, intensified emotions, and kept them hooked. Real control, the kind that let people shape their digital environment freely, was never on the table. Instead, the company preferred a model where users felt in charge, a comforting mirage that kept them engaged and docile. Sarah began to understand that this illusion of control was one of the platform's most powerful tools. It masked manipulation as autonomy, dependency as freedom, and as long as users believed they were in control, they stayed. They shared. They clicked, but the truth was simple and unsettling. Control was not given. It was taken. And on Facebook's watch, it had been slipping quietly away. Chapter 10, The Cult of Growth. Growth wasn't just a goal at Facebook. It was a religion. It consumed every meeting, every decision, every line of code. Like an unquenchable thirst, it demanded more users, more minutes spent, more ads clicked. For Sarah, this obsession with growth felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, racing faster and faster, ignoring the cracks forming beneath her feet. The company's mantra was simple: growth at all costs. Early days were fueled by idealism, connecting people, empowering voices, democratizing information. But as the platform ballooned, those ideals faded beneath the roar of quarterly earnings and shareholder demands. Every new feature, every product pivot, was justified by growth projections. Want to launch a controversial feature? If it boosts user numbers, do it. Worried about misinformation spreading? Only if it threatens growth, then maybe. Concerned about user burnout or mental health? If engagement dips, that's a problem. This relentless push-shaped culture, turning cautious engineers into aggressive marketers, curious thinkers into data-driven operators. Sarah watched as teams competed fiercely over growth metrics, often sidelining ethics or long-term impact. In internal meetings, any concern about societal harm was met with a shrug. We don't build for society. We build for users and growth. But growth wasn't a neutral force. It magnified every flaw. It accelerated every risk. It turned small mistakes into massive problems. The faster Facebook grew, the less control anyone had, and the more damage spread unchecked. Sarah understood then that growth was a double-edged sword. It was the engine of success and the source of recklessness. The cult of growth had blinded everyone to the cost. And that cost wasn't just numbers on a balance sheet. It was the erosion of trust, the fracturing of communities, the corrosion of truth. But no one wanted to say no to growth. No one dared. Because in the cult of growth, the fastest wins, even if the prize is ruin. Chapter 11, The Echo Chamber Effect. Facebook wasn't just a platform. It was a giant echo chamber, amplifying voices, ideas, and emotions in ways no one had fully anticipated. Sarah watched as users were funneled into bubbles, where their beliefs echoed back at them louder and louder, drowning out dissent and nuance. The algorithms, designed to maximize engagement, didn't care about balance or truth. They cared about what kept people clicking. If anger sparked more comments, anger ruled. If outrage boosted shares, outrage dominated. If sensationalism pulled eyeballs, sensationalism thrived. This echo chamber effect created tribes, groups more isolated and polarized than ever before. Friends became foes. Conversations became battles. Truth became relative. Sarah remembered a time when she posted a thoughtful article questioning a popular belief. The backlash was swift and brutal. The algorithm had already labeled her in a countergroup, and her post was buried under waves of opposing voices. She realized that the platform wasn't just reflecting reality. It was reshaping it. By feeding people what they wanted to hear, it gave them a distorted mirror, a world where their views were the norm and opposition was the enemy. The consequences weren't just online. They spilled into elections, communities, families. Division was no accident. It was a feature. And the louder the echo, the harder it became to listen. Sarah felt trapped in a system that rewarded certainty over curiosity, conflict over compromise. The echo chamber wasn't just a product flaw. It was a societal fracture, growing wider every day. And with each reverberation, trust and understanding slipped further away. Chapter 12, The Price of Denial. Denial was the company's greatest shield. No matter how many warnings piled up from employees, journalists, regulators, Facebook clung to a narrative of innocence and good intentions. Sarah had sat in countless meetings where uncomfortable truths were minimized or dismissed outright. We're doing our best. It's complicated. Others are worse. We're just a platform. These were the mantras that insulated leadership from accountability. But Sarah knew better. She saw the cracks beneath the surface. Denial wasn't just ignorance. It was a calculated defense mechanism, a way to avoid facing the real consequences of their actions. Admitting fault meant admitting responsibility, and responsibility meant change. Change threatened growth, profits, and power. So denial persisted, even as the damage grew visible to everyone outside the walls. The company's PR played on this denial, spinning every scandal into a story of progress and promise. But inside, Sarah felt the weight of truth pressing harder. Every ignored report of harassment, every overlooked algorithmic bias, every unchecked misinformation campaign, it all added up. Denial wasn't saving them. It was dooming them. Because the longer they avoided facing reality, the harder the reckoning would be. Sarah wondered how much longer they could keep up the act before the world saw the facade and demanded real change. Chapter 13, The Illusion of Choice. Facebook liked to tell users they had control, that every decision, every click, every share was theirs to make. But Sarah quickly learned that this choice was an illusion carefully constructed and maintained. The platform's algorithms shaped what users saw, how they felt, and even what they believed. It wasn't random. It was engineered. Designers crafted interfaces and notifications to guide users toward actions that maximize engagement and revenue. Options were presented, but often in ways that nudge users toward the right choices, the choices that serve the company's interests. Privacy settings were labyrinthine, buried deep and constantly shifting, making real control almost impossible. Users believed they were deciding freely, but in reality, their behavior was being steered at every turn. Sarah reflected on how subtle this manipulation was. Not coercion, but persuasion. Not force, but temptation. It was the difference between a choice and a channel. This illusion of choice kept users engaged in content, unaware of how much was happening behind the scenes. More than convenience, more than connection, this was Facebook's true power, the art of making people feel free, while quietly directing their journey. Sarah realized that the company's success depended less on users' choices than on how cleverly those choices were framed and limited. The freedom Facebook offered was more like a maze, with only one exit, and it led straight to profit. Chapter 14, The Cost of Ignoring Ethics. As Facebook surged forward, chasing growth and dominance, ethical considerations slipped further and further down the priority list. Sarah found herself increasingly troubled by the disconnect between the company's stated values and its actual practices. Every innovation, every algorithm tweak was measured by one metric: impact on engagement and profit. The question of she was replaced by could they maximize user time? Could they boost ad revenue? Could they outpace competitors? Rarely did anyone ask should they do these things. Ethics became an inconvenient roadblock in a race fueled by ambition and greed. Sarah recalled moments when employees raised alarms about potential harms, misinformation, addiction, privacy breaches, only to be told to focus on the user experience and business priorities. The company's leadership often saw ethics as a PR challenge rather than a core responsibility. This mindset allowed corners to be cut, consequences to be ignored, and harms to be dismissed as collateral damage. But the cost of ignoring ethics wasn't abstract. It was real, measurable, and devastating. Communities fractured, trust eroded, vulnerable people were exploited. And Sarah realized a deeper truth. Without ethics, power becomes reckless. Facebook's unchecked power came with a price tag, one paid by society at large. Ethical lapses weren't just missteps. They were systemic failures rooted in a culture that prized growth over goodness. For Sarah, this was the painful heart of the story, a cautionary tale about what happens when power divorces itself from responsibility. Chapter 15, The Fallout. The reckoning didn't come quietly. For years, Facebook had pushed boundaries, bending rules and norms in pursuit of relentless growth. But eventually, the consequences piled up. Scandals broke, public trust shattered, regulators took notice. Sarah witnessed the fallout firsthand. Users felt betrayed. Advertisers grew cautious. Governments threatened sanctions and investigations. The platform once hailed as a beacon of connection now teetered on the edge of crisis. Internally, morale plummeted. The idealism that had sparked the company's creation gave way to cynicism and fear. Employees debated whether they were part of force or good, or a machine that amplified harm. Sarah remembered heated conversations late into the night as teams grapple with their role in the unraveling. Yet, despite the mounting pressure, the company's leadership remained stubborn, doubling down on growth and deflecting blame. Public apologies were made, but many fell hollow. Mere PR gestures with no real change behind them. The fallout was a stark reminder that power unchecked inevitably invites collapse. Sarah realized the story wasn't just about a company. It was about a society grappling with new realities, where technology's promise came with profound risks. The lessons were clear but painful. Without accountability, power becomes dangerous. Without humility, progress becomes perilous. And without reckoning, change remains elusive. The fallout was not an end, but a crossroads, a moment demanding hard truths and courageous action. Careless People reminds us that unchecked ambition and ignored values don't just cost careers. They cost humanity. Power without purpose leads to ruin, and ideals without action fade fast. What part of this story resonated most with you? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear your takeaway. If you found the summary insightful, please like, share, and subscribe to Detailed Book Summaries. Join us as we keep uncovering the truths behind great books and the lessons they hold for everyday life. See you in the next one.